why does the U.S. have such a cozy relationship with Saudi Arabia and such a terrible relationship with Iran? Why does the U.S. accuse Iran of being the extremist supporter of terrorism, that it's such a threat to not only Israel but to the U.S.? And so I thought it was important to put out a book that was like the Saudi book, a kind of a basic book that tells the history, talks about the Iranian government today, the relationship with the U.S., the relationship with other countries around the world. But unlike Saudi Arabia, you have to really go back and talk about the history of Iran. That's a 2,500-year-old history of Persia, as opposed to Saudi Arabia that came into being in 1932. So very different countries in that respect. And while you have to recognize that although the U.S. is so close to Saudi Arabia because of buying Saudi's oil, because now Saudi Arabia is the #1 purchaser of U.S. weapons, it wasn't always like that. In fact, the #1 purchaser of U.S. weapons used to be Iran under the Shah. And so it's important to look back and see, what happened to this relationship and why was the U.S. supporting the repressive regime of the Shah. And of course, for that, it's very key to go back to 1953, to the U.S. CIA-backed coup that overthrew a government that was not particularly anti-U.S. at all. It was a government that wanted to use Iranian oil for benefiting the people of Iran, not for benefiting the British people, because at that time the company that controlled Iranian oil was the company that today is British Petroleum. And Mohammad Mossadegh, who campaigned precisely on this idea that we, the Iranians, should benefit from our oil, came to power in 1951. In the next 2 years, really started implementing his campaign promise, which was very popular among the Iranian people and extremely popular with the parliament that was in power then. In fact, the bill that he had crafted was passed unanimously by the parliament, and steps started to be taken to nationalize the oil. At which point the British, who had been trying very hard to get the U.S. to see how terrible this would be, finally convinced the Americans that not only would this be bad in the case of Iran, but what a terrible example Iran would be setting for other countries that had important resources that the U.S., the U.K., the Western world wanted to exploit. So it's kind of like that same idea of how dare the Iranians put their oil under their country instead of in a U.S.-friendly country. And so the CIA instigated the coup, and the coup was seen as a great success. And I think that's one of the important things to look at, that even when it's not some abject failure, like in the case of Iraq, when it seems like a success, these things have reverberations that go on for a long time. And so when the coup happened and the U.S. reinstated the Shah, it was an even more repressive government that cracked down on all dissent, that cracked down on all secular institutions, cracked down on all the progressive socialist institutions that existed in Iran, because Iran has quite a history of Marxist groups, socialist groups, and the only place where people really could congregate to talk about what are they going to do to overthrow this repressive Shah was the mosques. And that's how, when they finally were able in 1979 to overthrow the Shah, it was the religious institutions that were most organized to take advantage of that vacuum and then take power. So you have the 1979 revolution being not only anti-Shah, but anti-US. And I talk in the book about how that led to the hostage crisis with the students taking over the embassy. And for those of you who remember those days, it was a constant barrage of anti-Iranian messaging that would come out every night in the nightly news. It was the beginning of Ted Koppel's fame to be talking about the state of the hostage crisis. And for Jimmy Carter, it was a terrible blow, really affected his presidency. And the U.S., since the time of the Islamic Revolution, has been trying to find ways to get rid of that government. And so some of the ways have been pouring hundreds of millions of dollars of our tax dollars into covert activities, trying to foment revolution from within, partially through minority groups that live along the borders in Iran, arming countries around the borders, setting up lots of U.S. bases all over. If we had a screen here, I would show you a great map that just shows all the bases that are surrounding Iran. And then sanctions. So sanctions are not new. Sanctions have been in place in one form or another since 1979. And I think that was the most interesting thing for me in writing the book, was looking at the progression of sanctions, what kinds of sanctions, some against individuals, some against companies, some against U.S. companies doing business with Iran, all different kinds of sanctions. What it led to, because on the one hand, because Iran wasn't able to have open trade with the rest of the world, they developed a lot of indigenous businesses that were very creative, very clever at finding ways to produce things out of nothing. Two of the times that I was there, I met with wonderful women's business groups, and I asked them what was the impact of sanctions, and they told me all kinds of stories about not being able to get the supplies they needed, but most interesting was how they invented to get these supplies. And one was a chemical engineer and the kind of creations that she had to make these chemicals. One woman made dental equipment, and she said, you know, we had to just cannibalize from all kinds of other things to create the equipment, learn to produce things ourselves, start our own factories. And so that's kind of one of the positive things from the sanctions. On the negative side, there's all kinds of things. One is it really depressed the economy, huge inflation. It makes the people more dependent on government, because if you can't trade very easily, the companies that are able to get around the sanctions are the big ones. And those tend to be ones controlled by the government. So they're either controlled by the Revolutionary Guards that are part of the military, or they're controlled by these very powerful clerics. And so it has the opposite effect of what it's supposed to do. It strengthens the more conservative elements of the government or those more conservative institutions, and it depresses civil society, any kind of democratic institutions. And of course, with government propaganda as well, people tend to be told that this is all to blame on the outside world, not because of corruption or ineptness inside the government, which there is a lot of. So it really helps to strengthen these conservative sectors of the Iranian society. So the U.S. has been trying unsuccessfly to find ways to change the Iranian government. And that has been the case really until the Obama administration, when they came to terms and said, look, this government's been in place since 1979. It doesn't look like it's about to fall. Maybe we better come to grips with that. And we do not want this government to get a nuclear weapon. So let's speed up the discussions that have been going on for a long time now and see if we could come to some agreement. And so lo and behold, with a lot of diplomatic work, thanks to John Kerry, thanks to the Iranian foreign minister, and thanks to the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese, the agreement that was signed in 2015. And this was seen as the greatest foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration. Of course, when Trump was campaigning, he kept talking about it as the worst agreement ever. It was really a good agreement. I mean, Iran had to compromise tremendously, and the kind of intensive intrusion is something that is unique. We've never seen this before. The inspectors have tremendous access in Iran, and constant access. I mean, they don't come in and out. They are constantly there. And despite Bibi Netanyahu's theatrics of trying to show that Iran was a sneaky country not complying, the evidence all shows that Iran was complying from the time the agreement was signed. In fact, there were 10 different reports that the international institution called the IAEA had put out, said that yes, Iran is complying. Pretty much the whole world knew that Iran was complying. But there were elements that never wanted the agreement to work, and not only were it some of the Republicans and your own Chuck Schumer here in New York, but other countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia. In fact, not like Israel and Saudi Arabia, it was Israel and Saudi Arabia, maybe the Emirates as well. Saudi Arabia sees Iran as its nemesis and did not want to see a closer relationship between the U.S. and Iran. Pretty much the same thing for the Israelis. The Israelis, it turns out, according to John Kerry, after the negotiations, he came out and said that during the negotiations, the Israelis were always coming up to John Kerry and saying, you know, don't do this negotiations, bomb their facilities. Now, you have to just think of the chutzpah of the Israelis. There's no other word for it, really. When you see that that is the country that has been lying for decades now about its nuclear program, that has never admitted, won't even say straight up when you ask them, do you have nuclear weapons? They won't even say it. They have hundreds of nuclear weapons. They have never, unlike Iran, they have never joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have never allowed an inspector to go in, and they are the ones that are trying to out Iran for not complying, but really saying that Iran cannot get a nuclear weapon. Now, I don't know about you, I would like to see an end to all nuclear weapons all over the globe. But you must wonder how a lot of people around the world look at things when the U.S., that has thousands of nuclear weapons, says Iran can't have any, and when the Israelis, that have hundreds of nuclear weapons, say Iran can't have any. And Iran has been saying for a long time, even before the Islamic Revolution, actually under the Shah, that they wanted a nuclear-free Middle East. And the only country that was against it was Israel. So here you have an agreement that from the time that it was signed, you have the Israelis complaining, you have the Saudis complaining, you have Donald Trump saying, worst agreement ever. And lo and behold, shock to many of us in this country and the world, Donald Trump gets elected, and he continues to say this is a lousy agreement, a lousy agreement. Now, he did have people in power that he brought in who thought otherwise. And I don't know how you all thought when Rex Tillerson was Secretary of State. I thought, oh my God, a former ExxonMobil CEO being Secretary of State, how bad can it get? Well, looking back, he was one of the more adults in the room who thought it was important to keep the Iran nuclear deal, and that's one of the reasons that he got sacked. And you had H.R. McMaster, who is the National Security Advisor, who is considered another sort of moderate. These are considered, people are considered practical hawks. And that's a new term. And Donald Trump got rid of him and put in the worst person that could possibly be in that position, which is John Bolton. Now, John Bolton was just horrendous when he was a diplomat here representing us at the UN. And he was always, not just a hawk, he's like a super hawk. He's like a mean, nasty super hawk. He has constantly been saying the only way both in North Korea and Iran to deal with the problem is to get rid of their governments. So Donald Trump brings him into his inner circle. So between Saudi Arabia, Israel, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton on the one side, and on the other side is pretty much the rest of the world. I mean, it's all the countries that negotiated the agreement that says we want to keep this going. It's U.S. the public, because the public opinions show that the agreement got more and more popular with the U.S. public after it was signed, going from like 42% up to 67%. So vast majority of Americans thought the agreement was a good one that was working, that the U.S. should stay in. Even a super practical hawk like James Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, said, it's a good thing for us. It's good. It's in the best interests of the United States to stay in this agreement. A super hawk, somebody we're always fighting against in Congress when we as Code Pink go in to say, stop giving all our money to the Pentagon, is the head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House, and that's a guy, Ike Thornberry, and he said as well, it's a good deal. He didn't say it's a good deal. He says we should stick with the deal. It's in our best interests. Trump does not listen to any of them, and he pulls out of the deal. And so here's where we are now. And it's a very, very dangerous situation. You have the Europeans who are talking a very tough line right now and saying we want to stick to this deal. They've been meeting the past 2 weeks with the Iranians to say how can we make this deal work. The issue is this: if the Iranians don't get enough economic benefit from continuing with the deal, they will not stay with it. And there is a lot of pressure inside Iran. It is not a monolith at all. A lot of pressure inside Iran to say, the people who said, why did you ever, Rouhani, the president, believe that you could trust the West, believe you could trust the United States? We told you from the beginning, don't negotiate. We shouldn't have to negotiate this. We are a sovereign country. We're an autonomous country. Lo and behold, now they were proven right. We are not trustworthy. And so there's pressure to pull out of the deal. Rouhani wants to stick with the deal because he believes a better relationship with the West could be better for the Iranian economy. And the Iranian economy is in crisis. It has been bad since 1979. It's gotten a lot worse in recent years. And really, since Trump came in, got even worse. When the U.S. pulls out of the deal, what it means is not only is there a continuation that U.S. businesses can't trade, but it also means that the imperial United States will tell the other countries in the world that they can't trade with Iran and still have a relationship in the United States, an economic one. And that's the meaning of these secondary sanctions. You can't use U.S. banks, and the dollar reigns supreme in international commerce. So you can't use the dollar, you can't use U.S. financial institutions, and you will be sanctioned if you trade with Iran. So that is what is at play right now. Now, the Chinese have been trading with Iran all along, and they find alternative ways. They have set up a separate bank just to deal with Iran. They find ways around the sanctions. They set up companies that don't have any transactions in the United States. The question is, will the Europeans take that bold move? And the tough talk now includes things like setting up a separate bank, sheltering U.S. companies from sheltering European companies from U.S. sanctions. There was a bill that was passed in Europe in 1998 that was directed at the same kind of thing the U.S. did around Cuba, saying if you trade with Cuba, we will sanction your companies. They're thinking of reviving that bill. And that really is an interesting one because it says to European countries, you cannot obey U.S. law. It almost, it says those companies will be in violation if they obey U.S. law. And there is also talk that European companies would sanction U.S. companies working in Europe for the same amount that European countries would be sanctioned by the U.S. A lot of tough talk. Will it amount to anything? Well, there's a lot of people who say it will not. And I just wanted to read you a quote that's in a piece by The Economist that is actually coming out tomorrow. It's called, "For European firms, resisting American sanctions may be futile." And it concludes by saying, however murky America's system has become, businesses are in no mood to dismiss it. Doing business in countries that have been labeled as rogue regimes is not much good for their reputations. And much as they may dislike being a tool of Mr. Trump's unorthodox foreign policy, they know they cannot disregard it. So that is really the question of how much the Europeans will fight back over Iran, a country that is 80 million people, which is no small country, but it's nowhere near the size and the economy of the United States. And then businesses have to decide, is it worth the risk for them? And already both U.S. and European businesses are saying it's not worth it for them. And there were some big deals that have been negotiated in the last 2 years that are now put in jeopardy. One is with Airbus, the French company. Airbus gets a lot of its parts from Boeing and other factories in the United States. They don't want to be subjected to the retaliation. There are German companies like Volkswagen that want to go back. They used to sell cars in Germany, in Iran. They would like to go back in. Renault has sold about 600,000 cars in Iran just in 2016 alone. They want to keep selling cars there, but they are afraid of what the U.S. will do. So that's the situation right now. Now, I mentioned that the U.S. has been wanting to overthrow the Iranian government since 1979. So the idea is really not so much, this Iran nuclear deal is not good, we want to get rid of this deal. This is, how can we use our pulling out of the deal, increasing sanctions on Iran, secondary sanctions on Iran? How can all of this squeeze the Iranian economy so much that people will rebel? That's what they want to do. And the question is, what will this do inside Iran? Will people blame the U.S. and rally around the flag, or will they blame their government? And there were some demonstrations, you might remember, that happened in Iran at the end of last year, in December and into January, where they started spreading from one city to another. And the U.S. press was very excited, thinking this was going to be the end of the Iranian regime. And lo and behold, yes, the government did crack down on those protests, but they were very incoherent as well, and they didn't get a lot of support among the population, and they petered out. So the question is, what else can the U.S. do? Well, that brings me to a comparison between what the U.S. did in Iraq. And those of you who were following the lead up to the Iraq War might remember that while the U.S. was preparing militarily to attack Iraq, it was also trying to set up a government that would just be flown in and implanted in Iraq, and that was a U.S.-friendly government, and somehow this was all going to work out just great. And that was called the Iraq National Congress. The main person was this guy, Ahmed Chalabi, who hadn't been living in Iraq for longest of time, had no base of support inside Iraq. And of course, it did not work out the way the U.S. had planned. Well, the U.S. is trying to engineer a similar thing right now, but it's even worse because it's with a group called the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, which is known inside Iran and many places around the world as a terrorist organization. In fact, it was on the U.S. terrorist list until 2012, when there was a big campaign and a lot of money. Many people think it was Saudi money to pay off a lot of people to get congressional support for taking them off the terrorist list. It was known as a terrorist organization because they were very early on in the 70s doing suicide bombings. And then in the 80s, when it was the clerics that took over, the MEK started fighting the Islamic regime. And when the war broke out because Saddam Hussein invaded Iraq in 1980, invaded Iran, for 8 years, a very bloody, horrible war, the MEK sided with Saddam Hussein. And that is something that Iranians have a long memory about, because when you side with the enemy in this really bloody war in which 1 million people were killed, it did not sit well with the vast majority of Iranians. No matter whether they hate the government, their own government now or not, they do not like the MEK. So John Bolton has spoken at their conventions 9 different times. Their headquarters in Paris. They have another headquarters in Albania. Thank you. And it was quite interesting to see who showed up at the one convention they had here in the United States. Took place 2 weeks ago. The keynote speaker was none other than the former mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, who showed up at this convention and gave a ridiculous, horrendous talk about how we, meaning him and the MEK, because the MEK has paid him lots of money, will be next year in Tehran, taking over and being the new government. So this is being planned by Donald Trump and the people close to him. Inside Iran, it seems like the majority of people, whether they like their government or not, are looking around the region and saying, what are the chances for change that would make things better in Iran? And they say Iraq, disaster. They say Libya, disaster. They look at the presence of ISIS and Al-Qaeda that are Sunni groups, and how much they hate the Shia, which is Iran is a Shia country. And so you can imagine that most people think things could be a lot worse in Iran if this government is overthrown and there is just chaos and fighting over who's going to take over. They also think about how horrendous and catastrophic a war would be, either with the United States and Israel, the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's so many different scenarios, and each one of them terrifying. So it seems that most Iranians would prefer that the deal with the deal with the nuclear agreement would stay in place. The Europeans would find ways around, would continue trading. The Chinese, who are the #1 trading partner of Iran right now, would step in to fill some more of the void, and that we can stop Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu, which might even be harder, from an attack on Iran. Just to add to the complexity of it all, an attack might happen in one of the proxy places where the wars are raging right now. Because already we see Israel attacking the Iranians in Syria. We see the Iranians attacking the Israelis in the Golan Heights. We see Yemen becoming a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians. There are so many different scenarios where an already horrendous conflict in the Middle East can get even worse. And as much as Donald Trump might want to isolate Iran, or worse, The reality in the Middle East is there will be no solutions to any of the conflicts going on in the Middle East if Iran is not a part of that. And so I want to end with this thought that the people in the Middle East have suffered so much in all of these years. I mean, the war continues in Syria. The Iraqis are desperate that the new government that's being formed is one that can bring some stability to the region, but Iran has a lot of influence in Iraq right now. The war in Yemen, a catastrophic situation. Libya continues to be so divided, and a lot of different militia groups fighting for power there. The last thing the Middle East needs is another war. And so our job now, of course, is to figure out how to stop our government from taking us into another war. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to encourage people in the progressive movement and not in the progressive movement to understand more about the terrifying consequences of what we did back in '53, and to understand how much worse it would be if we tried to do a similar thing today. So I'll stop here and open it up for discussion, and thank you for listening.
Do you think that Kim Jong-un decided not to meet with Trump because of John Bolton, his shenanigans and what he said about Libya? You think that has anything to do with it?
Upcoming summit with Kim Jong-un of North Korea and Donald Trump, where Kim Jong-un is now threatening to maybe not go ahead with that summit. One of the reasons the North Koreans said is because they find John Bolton revolting, something that we might agree with the North Koreans on there, and that's because not only the comment he made of the Libya solution, which means we want them to totally dismantle everything in their nuclear weapons, and then we'll talk about lifting some sanctions. And of course, for Gaddafi in Libya, that ended up with him being killed. And but it's also the way John Bolton has talked about North Korea in the past, and all the times he has said that we need regime change in North Korea. So I think this is a salvo on the part of the North Koreans of saying, this isn't going to be a pushover. We're going to be tough negotiators. And also, it was interesting that North Korea had made so many concessions. Said we're going to dismantle our facilities. We're going to let inspectors in. We're going to stop doing our tests. We're going to free these 3 Americans who have been in prison. And they didn't object at the time to U.S. and South Korea continuing with their military exercises that in the past they have said are really provocative, because they are test runs for decapitation of the North Korean government. That's what they call decapitation. And so now they've come out and say that these war exercises that are going on now are a threat. Does it mean the meeting's not going to happen? Many people think it will still happen, but that this is to say that we are not a pushover, and watch it. So some people say that Donald Trump, he talks to people who are tough. And so the North Koreans are making that calculation and are continuing to be tough.
It's mostly because of John Bolton.
Huh?
Mostly because of John Bolton.
Because of John Bolton, and because the military exercises were supposed to be, the agreement is that they were going to go ahead, but they were going to be very toned down. And they haven't been toned down. They have B-52 bombers, they have F-35s, they're doing a lot more than was talked about. And so the North Koreans feel that is a provocation. That's not the spirit of how you go into negotiations. Now, what does this mean, or what does pulling out of the Iranian deal mean for North Korea? The North Koreans haven't talked about that. It's very interesting. They haven't said anything about it. But of course they are watching that. Of course they see how not to negotiate with the United States, and they are taking lessons from that. And part of their lessons is, we're going to be tough, and if we don't like the way the negotiations are going, we're going to pull out.
But that's good. But that having been said.
And the question was, does the moving of the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem have anything to do with the calculations around Iran? I think Netanyahu is pushing. I mean, look what he did in Gaza. Absolutely horrendous. And always seeing what they can get away with. And I think that they are pushing the United States to get involved militarily with Iran. And part of it is to, the provocations of moving the embassy and snubbing the entire sort of world community and international law, the provocations of killing unarmed protesters in Gaza. And while we don't get the kind of media coverage that we deserve among the mainstream media here, in a lot of the rest of the world, you have people just disgusted by what they have seen in terms of how the Israelis have reacted to the tens of thousands of people doing peaceful protest in Gaza. And yet Netanyahu just keeps going forward, keep moving forward, and he wants to see regime change in Iran, period. And he is basically saying, either you do it, the United States, or we're going to do it. And we'd rather you do it, because, he wants the U.S. to take responsibility for it. But I think he's provoking. And the fact, it seems like we only get news coverage once in a while about the Israeli attacks on Iranians in Syria, but it seems like it's actually something that occurs quite often, not the 2 attacks that have been talked about in the U.S. media. And that's a tremendous provocation, and people have been saying that the Iranian government and the Iranian military have been very restrained in their retaliation, because they're trying not to provoke the Israelis or the United States. But how long can that go on for?
As a matter of national pride, most of the Europeans would like to say, stay in the deal. I would think that somebody, the Europeans would be making the argument that, look, if it really comes down to hardball trade sanctions, the United States has more to lose than Europe does. I would see it in their advantage to play hardball and say, we're sticking with the deal, we're going to trade with Iran, do what you have to do, we'll do what we have to do. It would make Trump less popular in the United States. I think that they would win that particular battle. I don't know what your read is on that.
Well, it would make a lot of sense. The question is, do they have the guts to do it? Because the Europeans tend to talk tough and then not follow through. And I think when you looked at the way Macron came to the United States, the head of France coming here, he was like trying to appease Trump and saying, oh, you're so wonderful, you're so great, and you're right. There's a lot of things in this deal that have to change, and we need to talk about Iran's ballistic missiles, and we need to talk about Iran meddling in the region and its misbehavior. That fed right into Trump. And Angela Merkel was a little tougher from Germany, but basically what analysts now look at and say, it would have been much better to just come from the get-go before Trump had made the decision and say, we're going through with this, no matter what. You can pull out, you're going to be the odd man out, your companies are going to suffer, Airbus is going to get $20 billion deal and Boeing is going to get zero. Maybe that would have worked better. They went away empty-handed. And now they're starting to talk tougher. There's the European Union and the European Council. The European Council represents the heads of state of Europe. The head of the European Council yesterday came out with a very, very strong statement referring to Donald Trump, he said, with friends like these, who needs enemies? He said that if you're looking for a helping hand, meaning if you're looking for a helping hand from the United States to help ease these tensions, he says, just look at the end of your arm, because that's where you'll find the helping hand. Meaning we, the Europeans, have to go this alone. We can't count on the United States. The representatives of Trump in Europe have been terrible. Did you hear that the U.S. ambassador to Germany, on his first day on the job, put out a tweet like Donald Trump and said, the Trump administration has decided that, we are going to put sanctions on European companies, and so your companies better get out of doing business with Iran immediately. It was like telling them. And the press it came out saying the most unpopular person in Germany right now is the U.S. ambassador. There were all these great things saying, we thought that ambassadors would come and on their first day say, hi, my name is, so I'm very happy to be in Germany. Thank you for welcoming me, instead of putting out this threatening tweet. So in Europe, they're very, very pissed at Donald Trump and this whole idea of secondary sanctions, because it is so imperial. And you have others saying, are we vassal states of the United States, or are we autonomous countries? The foreign spokesperson for the foreign part of the European Parliament, Federica Mogherini, she is excellent and has put out great statements saying our companies must not be punished for mistakes made by the Trump administration. We will see if that turns into some mechanisms that will shield these companies, or will the Trump administration have enough pressure on it to say we're not going, or to quietly, maybe not say publicly, we're not going to implement those secondary sanctions. So let's see. But the country that benefits from all of this is China. Already in the last 2 years, China had been importing the vast majority of oil from Iran. In the last 2 years, some of that has gone to Europe. Now they're ready to take it back up again, but they know they'll get an even better price because there's no competition that Iran has. So the Iranians get screwed, the Chinese get more better deals, and they have been totally quiet throughout the whole thing, and all they're doing is ready to reap the economic benefit. In the meantime, the U.S. consumers have already been hurt, because from the time that it was clear that Donald Trump was going to get out of the Iran deal, the prices of gasoline have gone up at the pump. And you in New York City might not be drivers, but a lot of people in the U.S. are already hurt by that. And it's been calculated for the summer months, the average driver will pay an extra $200 because of this. So, because of the anticipation that oil is not going to be, the Iranian oil is not going to be on the market, and so there'll be less oil on the market, so the price of oil will go up. And of course the Saudis also benefit because they then fill in.
Kind of going back in the modern history of the U.S., can you think of any substantive examples of the U.S. being a good actor in the world? I mean, except kind of as a kind of a after effect of something else that we're doing, maybe we're doing the Peace Corps, but it's for, sort of underlying reasons. Is the U.S. well behaved at all, anywhere from your perspective?
Well, I'm sure you could find a program here and there that has done some good.
Yeah, but was it intended to do good in the beginning?
Well, I think we have seen over the years, I once worked at USAID. You can see the odd program here or there, the hospital here or there that's been built with U.S. money. But the vast majority of what U.S. does in the world is to enrich U.S. corporations at the expense of local people. Even when it's something like food aid. I used to be a nutritionist and I worked around food issues, and the U.S. was providing all this food to the World Food Program. Well, it was a program for U.S. farmers to buy their surplus, and it hurt local farmers because instead of supporting local agriculture, we were dumping our food on them. It wasn't even food that local people wanted to eat. Who wants to eat soy meal? I would agree with your premise there, and then you look at U.S. military intervention, then it's really, really harmful when you see the decades and decades of U.S. intervention overseas and what it's done. And it was interesting that the 1953 coup in Iran was the first covert coup of the CIA that was successful, and they went and then they used that model the next year in Guatemala for the coup there. They used that model in 1960 in the Congo. They used the economic strangulation in Chile in 73 when Kissinger famously said, make the economy scream. It is quite ironic with so much of the U.S. press just going bonkers around Russian intervention in our elections, when you have any sense of the history of the United States and what we have done to overthrow other governments, to decide who is going to be the leader in some other government, to support coups. It's pretty sad. Whether it's Egypt today that underwent a horrendous coup and the U.S. going back to supporting that government, or even Honduras, where the U.S. is supporting a coup regime, or just look at the $3.8 billion every year that the U.S. gives to the Israeli military. Our foreign policy makes us, as Martin Luther King said a long time ago, the largest purveyor of violence in the world.
So kind of the short answer would be no.
Yeah, with a few small exceptions.
Is there a site for all the different things that are going on in the world? Because I think a lot of people want to talk about what's going on, and in their heart they know things are wrong, but no one wants to look foolish with not having the language. So people, I think that's one of the reasons people stay silent. Is there a site that is a great kind of primer for all kinds of, this is what's going on with Israel and Palestine, and how it started?
Well, I would say doing the 1 hour a day of Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Is a great way to get started in the morning, if you can listen to it. Otherwise, you can listen to it any time of day online. But her 10 to 15 minutes of news and then breaking the rest into segments is so incredibly important and informative. There are plenty of other websites that, it's so sad that we have to go to, my partner Tig and I are always listening to foreign news because we find you hear real news on it. I can't stand the cable networks, whether it's Fox, CNN, or MSNBC. Because you don't hear very much what's going on in the world. So we listen to France 24, France 24, we listen to Al Jazeera, or to RT, or to BBC.
TRT.
But there are a lot of good on BBC online websites. We might want to shout out the ones that you like.
I get reader-supported news.
Reader-supported news is excellent.
The Intercept.
Yeah.
The Intercept is fabulous.
Black Agenda Report.
Black Agenda Report. Consortium News. Truth Dig. Common Dreams. Counterpunch. So these are all very good ones. But that brings me to a point, which is one of the things that this all has in common is that war is profitable. It is important to start digging under and saying, well, who benefits from war? For example, Boeing is now going to lose a $20 billion contract with Iran to update Iran's very old civilian fleet of planes, the average age of which is over 21 years, just like the Cuban planes are very old, and one of them just crashed today. Boeing is going to lose that $20 billion, and the CEO came out and said, well, he didn't use these words, but basically said, well, it's terrible that we would lose this deal, but leaving the Iran nuclear deal means there will be more conflict in the region, and more conflict means more business for us, because mostly their business is weapons sales. So we started a new campaign with a bunch of different organizations, Code Pink, called Divest from the War Machine. And we're going to pass out sheets right now because one of the ways to get at these companies is to go at the financial firms that invest in the companies. And the biggest one is Blackrock. I don't know if you've heard of Blackrock. It's a huge financial institution. They have billions of dollars invested in Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, the Israeli company Elbit, General Dynamics, and also gun manufacturers that are responsible for so many of the weapons in our own communities.
Do you think that we still have a democracy? And if you don't, do you think it's more of an oligarchy or a corpocracy?
I would say more a corpocracy. I think we still have a lot of democratic elements in our country, and that we should use them more than we do now. Tig and I are constantly in the halls of our Congress, and we have visitors coming from other countries, and they say, wow, you can just walk into your congressperson's office, and in Washington, D.C., you can actually do that. And there are, quote, public hearings. We wish they were more public, like the public could get 10 minutes at the end to ask our questions, or, somewhere where we could give our opinions. But they are public hearings in the sense that you can go into them. It's open to the public. We do have elections, and elections matter, as we see.
Voting.
And voting, as much as we have lots of problems in our system and voter suppression becoming bigger and bigger right now, we do have elections in this country, unlike other countries. So I think that we have to get over the notion that we're, not that people in this room probably in self-selecting, but a lot of people out there think we've got the greatest democracy in the world. The fact that the people who are running for office have to beg for money constantly is just absolutely absurd. And we have, as part of this campaign, Divest from the War Machine, we ask our elected officials to agree not to take money from the NRA or the major weapons manufacturers. And we say to them, you vote every year and many times a year for more and more money for the Pentagon. The Pentagon then takes half of that money and gives it to these weapons manufacturers. They then take a little bit of that money and give it back to you. Does that sound corrupt? Does that sound like a conflict of interest? So we say to them, will you pledge not to take money? And some of them have started to do that, and we would love your help to get more of them to agree not to take money from the weapons industry, just like we don't want them to take money from the fossil fuel industry, from the private prisons, and we're working with groups together on these issues. The U.S. does not have the same kind of superpower might it had in the past. Donald Trump is creating enemies among our allies. Some people say this might be a good thing. It might be a time when the Europeans get together with the Russians and the Chinese and say, we're not going to listen to the U.S., just like after Donald Trump came out of the Paris climate agreement, the rest of the world said, we're going to go ahead with it anyway. This is not the first time that Donald Trump has defied the rest of the world. So some people say, perhaps it will be a good thing. It will lessen the power of the U.S. It will show the Chinese and the others that they have to create more alternatives to the use of the U.S. dollar and the U.S. banking institutions. And this could help sort of erode the power, the misused power that the United States has. That's one way of viewing it. And I don't know, because the vast majority of the international commerce is still in dollars, is still controlled by the United States. So this is going to be a very interesting time to see how it plays out. And unfortunately, it's not just about economic transactions, it's also about military intervention. And that's really where we come in. We weren't able to stop George Bush in the invasion of Iraq. We've got to be able to stop Donald Trump from a military intervention in Iran. And I do think that Donald Trump does care about public opinion. So it is important to show that people care about this issue, to show our elected officials who've been saying way too little about this issue, to get them to come out and say, we want to stay with the world community. And there are bills now to stop Donald Trump from having the right to go to war with Iran without first consulting Congress, which is always a very scary thing because they tend to say yes. I do think it is important that we educate each other. That's why the book is important, getting it out there, passing it around to your friends, building up the anti-war movement that really collapsed under the Obama administration, and we need it back now. And the last thing I'll say, which is on a positive note, is that the movement against militarism, as it's being constructed now under the Trump administration, is not an isolated movement that is just looking at foreign policy. It's a movement that understands the only way we're going to build is if we really make significant connections to other movements that have more energy to them right now. And one of them is the student movement around weapons, around guns, around the NRA. And we've been working with the student movement to say to them, let's go after the NRA and the weapons manufacturers. We're also working with groups like the Poor People's Campaign. And if you haven't paid attention to it, you should. It's headed by Reverend Barber, who has picked up the mantle of 50 years after Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, taking on the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism, and adding the climate crisis to that. And it is really wonderful to see what is called a poor people's movement that is taking on the militarism issue. And in fact, every week takes on a different issue. The third week is going to be on militarism, and people around the country are going to be doing acts of civil disobedience related to militarism. We're going to be doing things in Washington, D.C. in the offices of those people who are the biggest hawks that keep us from ending the conflicts that we're already in. So I think it's exciting that there are those connections being made. It's a way to bring more young people into the movement, and it's a way to connect these two movements that do have a lot more energy right now than the anti-war movement does. So I thank you for coming here. I hope you'll buy a copy of the book. I thank my publisher right there. Please buy multiple copies. Thank you.
Thank you. Yay.